Okay, so this is the final reading for the first unit. So this Metamorphoses by Ovid will be on the first exam, and it's the last thing. Once we finish the chat and then the recording comes to me, and then I can get it loaded onto YouTube. At that point, I'll post it, and then probably tomorrow morning, I'll set the test to open. So it will remain open until next Tuesday night. So it'll open tomorrow morning, and I might even make it till next Wednesday night. That still gives me Thursday to grade it. But hopefully, if there's anything that you do have a question as if you're going through other works, make sure, and if you have to, go back to the lectures, especially, I mean, Iverson, you've been at almost all of them, but if there's something that you missed, make sure that you go and catch up on that, especially if it's a reading that gave you more trouble. Something that, some of these are easier to understand than others. And in fact, we're going to do, I mean, our next thing is Beowulf, but there's still, I mean, you guys at this point should be used to some of the styles that, in these translations. So I think so far you guys have had the hang of it, so we're okay. Okay, so let's talk about Ovid before we talk about Metamorphoses. Now, he wrote his two biggest books. They're all poetic. These are all translated into prose, but they were originally in Latin poetry, and this was written during the Roman Empire. So the god names it's kind of interesting that our translation of the Iliad, which was a Greek text, still used the gods' Roman names, but some of the Roman names double up. So for instance, Iris is Aurora. So she has two names in Latin, but she has a totally different name in Greek. And then where is he? Jupiter is being used in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Jove was the Latin name that they used in the translation of the Iliad, but they're the same person. So he's still king of the god. And it's funny because you'll probably recognize a lot of these because, like, instead of, like Saturn and Jupiter are obviously planets in our solar system. And so that's one reason why we tend to be more familiar with the Latin names for the gods than are the Greeks. And even with things like, probably one of the most well-known Greek figures or Greek heroes is Hercules, but that is also the Roman version. Heracles was the original. And so, but almost nobody calls him by that name. Ulysses is the Latin name for Odysseus, and even though we still have the Odyssey, even in some translations of the Odyssey, he's named Ulysses all the way through. So, and much of the reason for this, the reason we have the Latin, there are two reasons really. One is that we still, even though English is a Germanic language, we didn't have a written language until the influence of the Roman Empire. And then our English was written down in Latin, the Latin alphabet. We use the Latin alphabet. We don't use the Greek. And so Latin, and much of that is because of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which became, essentially made the Roman Empire into the Holy Roman Empire, but it also spread Catholicism all the way through everywhere. And that Catholicism was one of only two types of Christianity at the time. The only other one was the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they used a Greek Bible, and the Holy Roman Catholic Church used a Latin Bible. So all of the book was entirely in Latin. In fact, the Bible was not allowed to be translated until the mid 16th century. And lots of people actually were put to death for translating the Bible out of Latin into some other language. Today, of course, everybody is just, we all have, if you're a practicing Christian, most people have at least one copy of the Bible, if not many, and different kinds of translations. But Latin came about and kind of took over for the longest time because of the Roman Empire's influence, and then from that, the influence of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. So that's why so many people still use the Latin names. That's one reason why there's been a little confusion, because so many translators automatically went to the Latin. So I just don't want you to be really confused. In this case, though, and this is what's so weird, is even though Ovid is a Latin poet and he wrote in the Roman Empire, he was not a Greek. Pretty much all of these stories, both in Metamorphoses, which is it's a pretty long book, and it's kind of like the structure is all kind of like this first chapter, in that there are a lot of smaller stories all kind of interwoven, and they kind of go from story to story to story to story. And some of the translations don't even separate it like this, where they're separated into smaller little stories. They just kind of run together in a big long chapter. And so it can be very confusing. But the truth is all of these stories are Greek. Romans invented almost nothing as far as the gods and the stories of the gods and the heroes that the gods interacted with and the major events and everything. This all comes from Greek mythology. What Ovid did, though, is he translated it into Roman, with kind of a Roman sensibility and a Roman point of view. They didn't take gods as seriously as the Greeks did. And so these stories are meant to be almost comedic, or much more for salacious reading. So it's not like, these are not meant to be like lessons and super moral tales. In fact, for a lot of people at the time, Ovid was condemned as a kind of flighty poet, or even pornographic, or a lot of people kind of didn't like his poetry because they thought it was just too, I don't know, it wasn't high enough. It was dealing with what he thought would appeal to the average Joe, kind of like People magazine or something like that, as opposed to something snootier. And so they didn't like some of the subject matter he used, especially when we got to the second book of his, and that's Amores. And all that means is loves. So amore is it's actually Italian. You can hear, Italian comes from Latin anyway, but amor, mon amour, or something like that. That's in French as well. But amores just means loves. Different, like kind of like Metamorphoses. There's many of them, and almost all of Amores is filled with either Jupiter or Apollo or Mars, or all the different gods falling in love with some chick, or lust with some chick, and what ensues as a result. But there are some of those stories even in here. Even in chapter 1, we have the stories of Io and a few other people. Daphne is the other big one. But we also have, and this is one reason I like to teach the first chapter, we also have a lot of origin stories. And these kind of creation stories are common in pretty much every polytheistic or monotheistic faith system. There are always stories about how did we come to be? How did the earth get formed? How did the gods come to, or did God come to rule over the earth? What exactly happened before mankind happened? And in some ways they are meant to describe to us, or indicate, what our role is in the world. This is how the world was made. This is what we were put on the earth for. And so some of those stories actually are indicators of that. So that's why I know some people in their journals have already said, well, this, like Pyrrha and Deucalion reminded them of either Adam and Eve or of Noah. And the truth is that makes sense, because in fact, there are flood myths that run all the way through a lot of different faiths in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. In the Americas, it's a little bit different, because most of their creation stories that deal with flood myths actually start with the earth being covered completely by water. And then after a little bit, animals or somebody, or the moon goddess or something like that comes down, and they pull earth from the bottom of the ocean, and they pull it up and make land. and that's what the animals can live on. And so most of it's amazing how many flood stories in the Native American tribes, and both in North and South America, deal with the idea that first the world was a big flood. It was just one big ocean, and then land masses came up out of the ocean and formed mountains and islands and all sorts of stuff like that. So in this case, though, and this is one of the very first, I mean, Greek mythology, and we do have in Hinduism, which is one of the oldest faiths that's still practiced today, but but they have a lot of myths that deal with, how did the earth come to be? In Chinese mythology, the earth is flat. So it's carried on the back of 4 dragons at the key points on the corners. And so, there are a lot of, but that's only one region of China. And so there are so many different myths, and yet there are threads running through all of them. So you'll probably see, if you haven't seen them already, hopefully you'll see some of these. In this case, though, we start with chaos. And it's kind of, it reminds me a bit of kind of the Big Bang theory in astronomy. Where space was just matter. And then there's this poof or bang or whatever, and it kind of blew things outward, which is actually our universe is still expanding from this supposed Big Bang. And yet it formed, all the matter started clumping into planets and moons and asteroids and suns and things like that. So essentially that's sort of what's being described. It starts out as chaos, a raw, confused mass. But then, and it even says there was no Titan yet. So there's no God over any of it, shining his light on the world. And so there's no sun. There was no moon. That's waxing Phoebe. Waxing and waning, just like the moon. There was no earth. There was no air. There was no water. So it was just all a jumble of discordant pieces. And then finally it says, then it says though there, and then it says there wasn't, but I guess it was no balance. There were these things, but they were all jumbled up together. So it says there was land and sea and air, but it was unstable land, unswimmable water, air needed light. So there was nothing that was easily defined, nothing that if a person were there that they could like swim in, walk in, breathe. Everything was just kind of amorphous. And then it starts to be separated into pieces. So this conflict, this chaos was ended by a God and a greater order of nature, since he split off the earth from the sky and the sea from the land. Now this should sound very similar to the biblical creation, because in the 6 days of work, God separated different things, day from night, and water from land, and all sorts of different things. So it says when he disentangled the elements, he fixed them in separate places in harmonious peace. And the weightless fire, that's the sun that forms the heavens, darted upwards to make, he sends the sun out into the sky so that it can light up the atmosphere. Next came air in lightness and place. Earth, heavier than either of these, drew down the largest elements and was compressed by its own weight. It's funny because the details are almost like astronomical. They're almost like physical science, as opposed to some fantastical story or something like that. And then the surrounding water took up the last space and enclosed the solid world. So now we have air and sea and land. And so this kind of continues, he's kind of going through, this is how he created valleys and mountains and all sorts of things. And even and the Greeks were actually mathematicians and pretty good astronomers. In fact, they, long before, centuries before Romans even took them over, they had come up with the idea that the Earth was really part of a solar system, and the sun was the center of the solar system, and the Earth and many other planets went around the sun. But then when the Catholic Church took over, they actually claimed that that was heresy, and that the Earth was the center of the solar system, and the sun and all of the other things revolved around the Earth. And they did that. The that was pretty much law for 1,000 years. And so if an astronomer said, well, measurement wise, that doesn't make any sense, he could very well be put to death for heresy for stating that. In fact, a lot of astronomers were, a lot of scientists were put to death for contending that that's not possible. Even Galileo, who's of course pretty famous, he was forced to recant when he said that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, that it was revolving around the sun. And he came up, he reinvented, I guess, or restated the heliocentric version of the solar system. And he was forced to recant or be put to death. And so he recanted, and he was actually placed on house arrest for the last 11 years of his life because of this. So, but the Greeks knew there were poles. They knew there was a North and South Pole. Even though the Greeks were in these tiny little, sets of islands in the Mediterranean, they knew that there were poles to the Earth. They knew that the Earth moved. They even knew that there were parts that were too hot. And they knew that there were parts that were going to be cold, literally. So it's amazing science for the time period. We wouldn't have expected people who lived that long ago to know this, and yet they did. And so essentially, they even talk about the clouds and thunder and wind and lightning bolts and all this other stuff, all these different weather patterns. But so all of these different, they even name some of the winds. They name some of the areas too, like Persia and other parts of, especially the Roman Empire. But then we get to, and at this point too, it only says the world's maker. It does not say Jupiter or Saturn, or there's no name to the god. Okay, but it's a he. It just says he over and over, But essentially, once he creates all the earth and all the elements, the weather and the sun and all of the other things, then he had barely separated out everything within fixed limits when the constellations that had been hidden for a long time in dark fog began to blaze out in the whole sky. So that's the night sky. And so that no region might lack its own animate beings, the stars and the forms of gods occupied the floor of heaven. The sea gave a home to the shining fish. So essentially, he puts everything where they belong, but there was no human yet. Then finally, he was human. We made humanity. And it says either the creator God, again, still not named, seeded it from the divine, or the earth just kind of birthed it. They were born of the earth. It doesn't say specifically how humans happened. But then Prometheus is one of he is a Titan, and he's one of the oldest gods, but he became like the god of humans. Like that's his job. He was taking care of the people. So while other animals looked downwards at the ground, he gave human beings an upturned aspect, commanding them to look towards the skies. And he actually he ended up getting in trouble for it, but he really kind of took the mortals, the humans, under his wing. Prometheus did. And he'll eventually end up in Hades, punished because of the things he did to help out the humans. Mostly, he helped out the humans by giving them fire. And they weren't supposed to get it, but he gave it to them anyway because he liked them, and then he was punished for it. So eternally, he is punished for it. Okay, so now they talk about these different ages, and it's almost like, I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of things like the good old days. Yes, he was on house arrest. He actually was not allowed to leave his home. He was not allowed to publish anything else. That's Galileo. And sorry, I didn't see your question immediately. But And he never did. He published nothing else. But he also, Galileo, though he was a scientist, was an Italian. And the Italian, at the time that he was charged, Italy and a few other, like Spain, were still very much under the auspices of the Pope, of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. Much of the northern parts of Europe, though, by that time were Protestant. So Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. Martin Luther was originally a Catholic too, but then he saw ways that the Catholic Church, he thought, had kind of corrupted itself. And so he pushed for reforms within the church, and even sent petitions to get changes made so that these, the corruptions would end. And the Pope essentially told him to hush and to stop talking. So he printed them out and he posted them on the gates of on the doors of his church in Gutenberg and in Germany. And he was excommunicated for that from the Catholic Church. And then he burned his letter of excommunication on the steps of his church. And then they actually ordered his execution. So he went into exile. He actually fled and stayed in hiding for the rest of his life. Martin Luther did. But but literally the Catholic Church said if they found him, not only anybody who was harboring him, but he himself would be put to death. So, but Protestantism had really taken over England, the Netherlands, Germany, and everywhere north. And so if you were a scientist there, you were far less likely to go under to be put to death for something like this. But Galileo was still he was an Italian. And so when he published what he did, the Catholic Church didn't like it. They actually brought him, he had to face the charges in Rome, and they ordered him to recant. So that's the Catholic Church. Catholic Church was more concerned with the Catholic Church than with like science. So that was an issue for a long time. Okay, so with this is kind of like the next few ages. Are you going to have to remember these? No, I'm going to make that very clear. You don't have to remember, but it's essentially starting out like everything was beautiful in the Golden Age. It even says like where is it? The untilled earth gave of its produce. In other words, you didn't even have to plant plants for vegetables and fruits to grow. You could just eat them, and they didn't need to be renewed. They didn't need to be replanted. And sometimes rivers of milk flowed, sometimes streams of nectar and golden honey trickled from the green holm oak. So everything was just in abundance. It was like Eden. It even says spring was eternal. So it never got cold. Things never died. Everything was beautiful. Okay. Now what changed? And people passed lives in gentle peace and security. Now this wasn't two people. It wasn't Adam and Eve, but it was all of them. But the whole community was happy. They had lived easy lives. They had easy food. They didn't have to work to live and to live well. But then when Saturn was banished to gloomy Tartarus, Tartarus is a part of Hades, the underworld. It's the part where people are tortured. And Jupiter ruled the world. So once Jupiter took over and banished the Titans, because there are really two strains of gods. We have the Titans, who are the older gods, and then Saturn was told, it's kind of like the Oedipus myth. If you have a son, your child's going to kill you. And so Saturn his wife Rhea would have children, and he'd eat them. So he just like eat them up, and he ate 5 of them in a row. And then Rhea it depends on the story. She either gave him a rock to eat instead of a baby, or gave Jupiter a sword or something, a knife, so that when he got eaten, he ended up cutting himself out from the inside out, like cut through his dad's stomach, and freed himself and his 5 siblings who were just kind of sitting in Saturn's stomach. And so once that all happened, they rose up and they defeated the Titans, and they put them all in Tartarus. And then they took over. The Olympians, those are the Olympian gods, they took over, but then once they did that, it says, then came the people of the age of silver. It's inferior to gold, but it's better than it's going to become. So it's almost like we started out golden. We were great. And then it got a little bit lesser. But it even said that, Jupiter actually changed spring's duration. He made it harder on people by giving us seasons. So things died. Sometimes it was, the air was too hot and nothing would grow. It was too dry. Sometimes it was icy. So he actually gave us seasons, but that made life not as good. So then you had to plant stuff, and it was hard. It was hard to reap your stuff, get your food and survive. Then we get to the Bronze Age, and people get meaner. The people of the Bronze Age had fiercer natures, and they had a lot of warfare, but they weren't quite vicious yet. They just fought a lot with each other. And then the Iron Age, and that's all they really say about the Bronze Age. Then the Iron Age comes, and the Iron Age is mean, and it's wicked, and they cheat each other and lie about each other, and they kill each other all the time, and they're just awful. And because of that, essentially, there's tons of war. People are always stealing from each other. Friend was not safe with friend. You couldn't trust anybody. Husbands longed for the death of their wives, wives for the death of their husbands. So people weren't even happily married. Murderous stepmothers mixed deadly aconite, so a poison, and sons inquired into their father's years before their time. So that sons want their dads dead, and it's all bad. And because of that, so essentially, because of that corruption, it allowed the giants to come up and rise, and they tried to rebel and take over Olympus, but he was not. They weren't successful, but they kind of added to the destruction of that age, of the Iron Age. And so, and it's funny because they mention Lycaon. So it says Saturn, son, the father of the gods, that's of course Jupiter, saw this from his highest citadel. So he sees that the giants are growing in numbers and getting stronger. And he recalled the vile feast at Lycaon's table. So recent it was still unknown, his mind filled with great anger. And he called the gods to council, and he said, essentially, they even mentioned the Milky Way. That's from the Greeks as well, because the Greeks were the ones to discover the Milky Way, which we are a part of. But essentially, he says, look, humans have gotten so bad. And now the giants are out there. They're just bad. I must destroy the human race. I swear it by the infernal streams that glide below the earth through the Stygian groves. I'm going to try to do other things, but if they won't, if I can't help them, we got to kill them all. And then he mentions Lycaon again. And this is where we get to the story of actual Lycaon. And all the gods knew, they're kind of really upset about it. But they even said, and this came about when, this is Julius Caesar, when the impious band of conspirators were burning to drown the name of Rome in Caesar's blood. So this is when Julius Caesar, around the time that Caesar was assassinated. The human race was suddenly terrified by fear of such a disaster that essentially there would be this huge flood, which is funny because we know there wasn't an actual flood during Roman history. And so, but he acts like, he acts like it was. So, but then he says, Jupiter, instead, he does, at first he says, okay, I need to tell you about what Lycaon did. Okay. And this is where we find he's like the first sinner of Ovid's Metamorphoses. He's the first bad guy who, well, he was not a god. the first human bad guy. And he essentially, he'd heard that humans were pretty bad. So he goes down in disguise. And this is actually a really common trope. It's a pattern that's used in a lot of faiths. Even in Christianity, there are, I still remember singing a hymn that talked about, if that you be careful how you treat somebody because they could be God in disguise, and if you treat them badly, you may be essentially failing a test being given to you by Jesus or Jehovah. And so, it's funny because that's what he says. He goes, I went down, he goes, I wanted to see if it was really that bad. And he says, and he even said, hoping it false. Like, I hope that humans aren't that bad. I went down and I traveled to earth, a God in human form. And he said it was awful. People were awful. And finally, I entered the inhospitable house of the Arcadian king Lycaon. Okay. And I gave them signs that a god had come. So he even says, so he doesn't stay in disguise like I'm just a beggar. He makes it clear I'm a god. And the people began to worship me. At first, Lycaon ridiculed their piety. First, he makes fun of the people who are worshiping him. And then he exclaimed, I will prove that whether he's a god or a mortal. So he's going to test the god, which is something mortals are not to do. Okay. This is like not only pride, but he is essentially, even though he is a king, but as a king, he's still mortal. And so he should never place himself above, especially the God of gods, the king of the gods, who's in charge of all of them. So he ridicules the people who are worshiping Jupiter, and then he says, let me test him. And he wanted to destroy me in the depths of sleep at night. So he was hoping to kill him. That's how he resolved to prove the truth. But then he wasn't satisfied, so he took a hostage, opened his throat with a knife, and he killed a guy. This is what Lycaon did. And made some of the still warm limbs tender in seething water. So actually roasted and boiled parts of the person. No sooner were these placed on the table in front of Jupiter than I brought the roof down on the household gods with my avenging flames. He was furious. Absolutely furious. Because essentially, gods don't really eat people food. And they certainly don't eat people. They're not that. They eat nectar and ambrosia. That's all the gods dine on. They don't even, they might smell the meat if you make a sacrifice to the gods, and they go, it smells good, but they don't eat it. Like it's almost like they're all vegetarian or something. But he was not only trying to feed him meat, he was trying to feed him human. And essentially his contention, like Cain's contention, seems to be that if the god ate the human, then that would either diminish his powers or prove he wasn't a god. And that would have been, to him, that would have, of course, proven himself right. And it was important to Lycaon to put himself above the gods. Well, so Lycaon ran away in terror, and then he ran out to the fields, and foaming at the mouth. Of course, this is part of the transformation. This is what Metamorphoses means. So this entire book is about ways that humans or gods are transmuted into something else. And so this is Lycaon. He runs out into the field, but then he begins to foam at the mouth. He's greedy as ever for killing, and he turns against the sheep, still delighting in blood, and he turns into a wolf. And that's where we get, even I can't remember what they're called. There's even the Latin name for, like, the scientific name for wolf, comes from Lycaon's name. And lycanthropy is actually the whole, like, people turning into wolves and like werewolves and stuff. So he turned him into a wolf as part of his crime. Now, once Lycaon dies, he is tortured forever in Tartarus. So he goes to Hades and is tortured for the rest of eternity because he was a really bad dude. So now he says, he goes, look, everything's bad. One house has fallen, but others deserve to also. So let them pay the penalty they deserve, and quickly. I think we need to do anything. And he starts the flood. Okay. Now what's different about this particular flood myth, though, is that there's no warning. So Noah, remember, was told, build a big boat, put 2 of every kind of animal on it. Actually, it's 2 of every kind of unclean animal on it, and then 7 of every clean animal on it, so that we could eat them. Like sheep, there were 7 sheep on the ark. But he was prepared. He had probably months to prepare and round up all the animals so he could put them on the boat. But there was no preparation. He's just mad, and everybody else nods. They're all okay. They go, yeah, okay, and they're either excited or they just nod and they're sad. But it even says they were all saddened at this destruction of the human species. Like, and they even said, what would the world be like without humans? Like, this is going to be weird. And it also means I'm not going to be, these gods are not going to be worshipped anymore, So anyway, so he starts everything raining and blowing and everything else. I mean, literally, he let loose the south wind, and it's just pouring rain. And it's all getting worse. Okay, so the cornfields are flattened, saddening the farmers, the crops, the objects of their prayers are ruined, everything is destroyed. And then the flood, but he's not happy. It's not enough. We have to cover everything. And he says, throw open your doors, drain the dams, and loose the rains of all your streams. And he tells Poseidon to do this. And the rivers return and uncurb their fountains, mouths, and so everything just, the flood happens. All the water is released over the land. And Neptune, also has the ability to make the earth tremble. So there are earthquakes, and that opens up the land and allows more water to rush out. And so it's just water. All is the sea without a shore. There's one man, and this is when we meet. One man sails over his cornfields in a boat, or over the roof of his drowned farmhouse, while another man fishes in the topmost branches of an elm. So it's funny because they're okay. Well, I have to eat, But even the animals, there are dolphins in the trees, wolves swim among the sheep, and the waves carry tigers and tawny lions. The boar has no use for his powerful tusks, the deer for its quick legs. Everybody's like swimming around in the water. And they're all going to die, essentially. But then we get to this exception. And so here's this little, this couple, Pyrrha and Deucalion, when Deucalion and his wife, and her name's Pyrrha. I'll type it in here. I don't see it in this translation. Pyrrha is her name. But when they get there, they landed here in their small boat. Everywhere else had been drowned by the waters, and they worshipped. They essentially found land, and then they like immediately started worshiping gods. And it says, no one was more virtuous or fonder of justice than he was, and no woman showed greater reverence for the gods. So both of these two people, despite the rest of humanity, are good people. And when Jupiter saw the earth covered, and that only one man was left of all those thousands of men, only one woman left of all the thousands of women, and that they were both good people, he stopped all the stuff. So all the winds went away, and the waters start to recede. And so that, and in fact, even Triton, blows his little conch shell or whatever, and everything starts to recede. So they all kind of take their cue from Jupiter. But then Deucalion, so all the water is coming down, it's all kind of muddy and icky, but they're still unhappy. Deucalion and Pyrrha are just like, what are we supposed to do? We're now all alone. And the sea's taken everything. We're all gonna, what if the flood comes back? And it's funny because in the biblical flood myth, Noah gets a sign. He takes his sons and their wives and then his own wife, and they get on the boat, and they're on the boat for, it rains for 40 days and 40 nights, and then they're on the boat for several months beyond that. And then when they finally see land and they stop and everything, well, they at least have a lot of people, at least several people that they can use to kind of repopulate the earth. But it's just Pyrrha and Deucalion. That's all that's left. And he says, but what if there's another flood? Well, in Noah's story, there was the God put up a rainbow saying, I'm not going to ever flood the earth again, And so in this case, though, they don't have a sign. They're just like, what are we going to do? And so they pray to the gods. And then essentially, what are we supposed to do now? And Themis, the goddess that they pray to, said, go ahead and leave the temple, go back. And it says, and loosened, let's see, with veiled heads and loosened clothes, throw behind you the bones of your great mother. And they're just like, what? It's a cryptic thing. It's almost like the Oracle at Delphi. It's not going to tell you anything point blank. And so they walk back, and they're just like, they don't know what to do. And she's afraid to ask what that means. Like Pyrrha and Deucalion are both afraid. What does that actually mean? But then Prometheus' son comforted, so essentially they comfort each other. He says, I think this is the right one. Okay, I think this is what they want. Our great mother, it must be the earth. I think the bones she spoke about are the stones in the earth. That's what we have to throw behind us. So he thinks, essentially, Deucalion says, I think this is the riddle that they gave us. And so that's what they do. They throw dirt, rocks over their shoulders, and what happens to the rocks? They become people. They begin to lose their rigidity and hardness, and after a while softened, and then they essentially grew and turned into human shapes. And so suddenly we had a whole lot more men and women. And that's why, and because we were born of the earth like that, it reminds me too of, in a lot of funerals, they do the ashes to ashes and dust to dust, that you came from the earth, and to the earth you will return. That's very much along the same lines as this. So, and they said because they came from the earth, they're tougher than the previous human species. And then of course more stuff grows, more animals, everything. And it even says, and from these two, so heat and moisture mixed together, and they all made more animals and plants and birds and all sorts of other stuff. Okay, so then we get to the first of the kind of chase scenes, I guess we'll call them. This is an actual chase scene. So Phoebus, this is Apollo. His name is in both Greek and in Latin. He is Phoebus Apollo. So anytime you see either one of those words, Phoebus or Apollo, that's him. So Phoebus Apollo, though, is essentially, they actually create, one of the species that's created is the python, which is of course scary because it can, kill people. And then the archer god, that's Apollo, with lethal shafts that he used only before on fleeing red deer or roe deer, destroyed that creature. Then the venom running out from its black wounds. Then he founded these games, and so he crowned, and with those games he crowned, they didn't have the laurel yet, but this is the beginning of how we got the laurel tree. So a lot of these stories are origin stories. How did we get spiders? How do we get, that was from Arachne, Medusa, the story you mentioned earlier, you know, it's very much along these lines. And Medusa, her story is actually in one of these tales. I don't know if it's in Metamorphoses or if it's in Amores, but in this case, it's probably somewhere in Metamorphoses. I just don't know what chapter it's in. But because she's transformed from a beautiful woman into someone with snakes in her head. But Phoebus, the first mortal that Apollo ever fell in love with was Daphne. But he fell in love with her not naturally. It wasn't like she was just, oh, she's so pretty, and so he falls in love with her. But because Cupid, the god of love, he shot him with an arrow. But Cupid has two arrows. So he has an arrow that makes you really lustful for somebody, and you have an arrow that makes you hate somebody. So he has it's weird. It's like, I guess it trying to explain how relationships go bad. I don't know. But in this case, what Cupid did, I mean, because Apollo is a god, so he's supposed to be super pretty, and unfortunately he and Cupid had some altercations. So Cupid very often shot him with arrows and made him lust after people, and mostly as a prank. But this prank ended up, going badly for Daphne especially. But what happened is he shot Apollo with an arrow that made him fall in love with Daphne, but he shot Daphne with an arrow that made her absolutely not fall in love with Apollo. And so essentially it was explaining why Daphne would run away. And, because she can't have an opinion. Obviously, if Apollo comes by, she's supposed to just want him, which is weird. But, and so that's what he does. And then once he instantly saw her and fell in love with her, well, he starts running after her. And he really is. He's like chugging through the forest, chasing after her. And she didn't really want, she was kind of, Phoebe didn't want to be like in a relationship. They even says she was averse to being wooed, free from men and unable to endure them. So she was kind of a virgin, and she doesn't want to get married. She doesn't, and her dad would even say, "You need to get married. You owe me a son-in-law, and you owe me grandsons." But she doesn't want to get married. And she goes, "No, but I don't want to get married. Let me be a virgin forever." And he says, "Okay, fine." And well, Phoebus sees her, wants to wed her. Of course, that's a euphemism, because Apollo can't marry everybody. But he really wants her. And at that point, maybe he did want to wed her, because this is the first person he's ever fallen in love with. And so the god was altered by the flames, and all his heart burned, feeding his useless desire with hope. He sees her disordered hair hanging about her neck and sighs, "Oh, what would she look like if she did her hair?" And he can't, he just all he does is lust after her. And so he's chasing after her, and she flees from him. She doesn't want to be anywhere near him. And so finally, even though he's pleading with her, "Come on, please, just, I'm so in love with you, blah, 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 blah. And you might hurt yourself running away from me, and scar your legs. I just want you, please, come on." And that's not what she wants. Remember, was given the other arrow. So she wants marriage even less than before. And so she begs, she pleads with her father to get away, because all she's doing is running and run. They would have run for goodness knows how long, forever. So the virgin and the god, he driven by desire, she by fear, he ran faster and allowed her no rest, hung on her fleeing shoulders, breathed on the hair flying around her neck. This is actually really disturbing, because it's frightening. It's like he's the predator. And her strength was gone. She grew pale, overcome by the effort. And so she cries out for help. And she says, "If your streams have divine powers, change me, destroy this beauty that pleases too well." And so she is turned into the laurel. And laurel, I guess, certainly to a lot of people was one of the most beautiful trees. Laurels in general, there are a lot of trees in the laurel family, and so a lot of them are quite beautiful. So even though she turns into a tree and Apollo can't change her back, he still feels that she's inside the tree, like he knows it's still her. And so he kisses the tree and then he says, since you won't be my bride, you must be my tree. And he takes on the laurel as his symbolic tree for the rest of, and so when they do like those games that they talked about, now he uses the laurel to and makes a laurel wreath on the crown of whoever wins the games. And so that's kind of where but it's funny because it's not, we always attribute this to Greek mythology, but there are actually transformative stories in almost every mythology. And it still makes me think about, there's a Native American story where a woman is being fought over, and this is of tribal communities that are now pretty much reside in Washington State. And the woman, one guy wants her and the other guy wants her, and they're going to go to war over her. And so she prays to the gods, please make it so that the war doesn't happen. And the answer is to turn her into a mountain. And as long as there's peace, then the mountain won't erupt. But if men go to war, then the mountain will erupt. And it's actually Lou Witt. That's the name of her name. And if you look up Lou Witt is also the name, one of the names for Mount St. Helens, which blew in 1980 or 81, I can't remember which. And so people were like, oh my gosh, that's Lou Witt, because it was always, because it has been, it's a dormant volcano. So is Mount Rainier. So are many mountains actually up in the Pacific Range. So they haven't blown in a long time. So they look like they're just mountains, but yeah, so supposedly, but again, by Native American myth, this was originally a woman and she was transformed. Now, there are actually so many stories all the way through Metamorphoses of women being turned into flowers. Actually, there's one where a boy is turned into a flower, Narcissus, and that's where we get a narcissist because he's very self-centered. We get a lot of different trees from this. Springs or waterways or something like that can come from something like this. So these are all sort of origin stories. But now we have another one, and this one's a bit more disturbing. And it even says Jupiter's rape of Io. So he does actually rape her. Jupiter falls in love with all sorts of women, and over and over and over. And most of the time, too, what's interesting is he's not hit by an arrow from Cupid. He just does that. He sees a woman, he's like, wow, she's pretty, and he just goes after her. But he doesn't chase after her. I mean, Apollo always seems to be running after women. Jupiter doesn't do that. Instead, he disguises himself as things. And that's what's really important, is that it's a warning in some ways to women, that you need to be careful where you go. Careful, don't be alone. Don't walk into a place that you don't know. Don't go into the woods where you can't be seen, stuff like that. And so, he sees her and he goes, someday, he's tempting her to go into places she shouldn't go, find shade in the deep woods on a hot day. And he showed her the wood shade. But if you're afraid to go in there, you can go into the remote woods in safety, protected by a god. And he says, that's me. I'll protect you. But she knows, oh wait, I'm not protected. So it's like some guy coming up to you at a bar and going, yeah, you can go with me, go home with me and I'll protect you. And you're like, no, yeah, nah, you're not going to protect me. And so she runs away. She had left behind everything. She ran away. And so, but then the god hid the wide earth in a covering of fog, caught the fleeing girl, and raped her. So this is not, oh, well, this is not consensual. She did not want to be She was running away from him, but he covered everything, so she got lost essentially. And then he found her in the mist and raped her. Now, Juno, his wife, because he's married by this point already to Juno, she sees all the vapors. She sees all the mist on the ground, and she's like, what is that fog? And she goes, either I am wrong or I am being wronged. And she assumes it's Jupiter's up to no good, which is true. He's not. He's exactly the reason all that stuff is down there. She's totally right. He is being unfaithful. He also raped a woman, and he lied. So, it's funny because he's afraid of what's going on. What does he do? He had a presage of his wife's arrival and changed Io into a heifer. So he changes this woman after he's raped her. He changes her into a cow to hide the fact that she was a woman that he was with in the fog. And so he lied. He said that the heifer had been born from the earth, and what happened? Well, Juno took her. She goes, ooh, I like her. I'll take the cow. And he had no choice but to give the cow to, no, he did have a choice. He said, what could he do? Well, he could say, I was bad and I did this wrong. So instead, what happens is she's kept prisoner and guarded by Argus, who has all these 1,000 eyes. And she's trapped and she's miserable. She runs around, she walks around just mooing and lowing and being so sad. And she can't, there's nothing she can do. She grazed on leaves of trees and bitter herbs. And she even says she often lay on the bare ground, and the poor thing drank water from muddy streams. She's miserable. And then finally, she actually sees where she used to play. She sees where she used to live, and she looks into the riverbank, looks down at herself, and realizes she's a cow. And she's just so devastated. But she sees Inachus, that's her dad, and he didn't know her because, of course, she was in the form of a cow. But she followed her father, followed her sisters, allowing herself to be petted and offering herself to be admired. So they were like, oh, what a pretty white cow. And they're petting her and patting her on the head. And, and they're just like, she's so sweet. And they're giving her food. And she licked her father's hand and kissed his palm. But she's crying through all of this, but she can't say anything. She tells her whole story and then she just can't, she's just kind of, she starts she just moves, but then she starts to write letters with her hoof, and instead of words she traced the sad story of her changed form. And then he reads, pity me. And he says, are you really my daughter I searched the wide world for? And he says, oh my gosh, now I'm more sad because I've been searching for you, but now I'm more sad because now I found you, but you're a cow. And here I was arranging a marriage for you, hoping for a son-in-law and then grandchildren, and now you're a cow. And now I'm going to have to find a bull to marry you because you're a cow. And that's just sad. And as he mourned, Argus, with his starlight eyes, drove her to distant pastures. So even as he realizes what Io is, Argus takes her away. He drags her out of her father's arms. And so now she's super miserable. And so what Jupiter does is he sends Mercury, the messenger god, and Mercury kills Argus, the guy with 1,000 eyes. And then those eyes become the markings in a peacock. So all because the feathers have eyes on them, and so that's where they end up. Because the peacock is actually the animal, one of the bird most loved by Juno. And first he plays his reed pipe, and then he puts him to sleep, and then he kills him. Okay. And then it actually doesn't go to the end of that. It skips to another little story, but we don't have to, don't worry about the Mercury tells the story of Syrinx. Don't worry about that. We'll skip back to Io because he does, that's one thing that's, it's a bad thing about Ovid is if you're not really well versed in all these myths, it's kind of hard to figure out where are we now. But thankfully, I'm really glad we have a translation that does these things so that you can know kind of where are we. And so eventually what happened is he frees Io. Eventually she gets returned to her previous appearance. He goes and essentially I've said essentially 3 times in this last 2 sentences, but he goes up to his wife and admits what he did. And that's the first thing. And so once he does that, and he says, I'll never see her again. Don't worry. Do not fear. In future, she will never be a source of pain to you. Of course, Io's just been tortured this entire time. Juno, though, calms, and then Io gets to get turned back into a girl. And once she does that, she, she's afraid to speak because she's afraid she'll keep mooing. But then when she eventually, I mean, and that's one thing too, anytime Zeus or Jupiter has, whether he rapes a woman or it's consensual, they always have a kid. And so then she bears a son, and she's going to be eventually honored about all of this, but she was still, I mean, a victim of rape. So anyway, Epaphus, though, her son had a friend named Phaeton, and he was the child of the sun. And this Phoebus, who is not Phoebus Apollo, it's the only time that it's confusing because in Roman mythology, there's a Phoebus and then there's a Phoebus Apollo, and Phoebus is just like the sun. And so, but Phoebus, the sun, essentially, normally his job every day, and that's how they, I guess, explain why the sun moves across the sky, is his job is to ride a golden chariot from dawn until dusk, and so that we have sunshine every day. And it's funny because Phaeton, who's a kid, he's only a little kid, but he really wants to, he boasted in front of his friends that first that Phoebus the sun was his father, and they don't believe him. And he says, oh yeah, he goes, that's not, he says, I am too. He goes, let me prove it. Okay, so he's going to prove it, and he essentially wants to prove it by riding the chariot himself. So he tries to get his dad to let him, but he has to, like, can I ride the can I ride the chariot, Dad? Can I ride the chariot? He's really annoying until finally his dad relents. Okay, and it's son. He even says, he goes, son, you already know that you're the child of the sun. You don't have to prove it to anybody. And essentially, he's saying you don't have to prove anything. But, and that's the mom talking. She says, you're absolutely your father's son, and he's all happy. And we're not going to go on to book 2, but essentially what happens is he begs his dad says no, and then he begs his dad again, and his dad says yes, but he warns him, now don't fly too close to the land, and don't go too fast, and don't fly too high, and all these other things, gives him all these warnings about how to do the chariot. And the kid just burns up completely, and he ends up scorching the earth, and even says he ends up burning different parts of the earth, and that's why there are deserts in those areas. And then Phaeton dies. He actually passes away. His dad has to take over the chariot, and Phaeton dies. So it's one of those many warning sort of lessons. There are a lot of them actually in Greek mythology where it's warnings against, for women, warnings for, about not going into dark places or the fog alone, and warnings against children. Don't take on too much when you're not ready. And don't let, your desire to impress other people make you do stupid things, which is pretty much what happened to Phaeton. Do you have any questions? I mean, that pretty much explains that chapter. And those are the, probably there might be something about Phaeton, but probably not, because the story's not quite finished. But there definitely could be a question about Io and how that all happened, and about Daphne and Apollo. And there could be something certainly about Lycaon. So, but I mean, most of the test is going to center around the characters. What did they do? What happened? And then a few of the themes. Like there could certainly be, I always have one essay question, and it's almost always about, some theme, and I want you to look at it in 2 different works or something. So it'll be something, though, that we've talked about in class. And since you've been here, Iverson, and so you've essentially been here through all but like 2 of the lectures, you're going to have all that. You will have been at the discussion. So, but okay, go ahead and ask about the essay. I know you emailed me about writing about Medusa, but since she's not in the readings, it would be better for you to write about something else. If you want to talk specifically about a woman, okay, all I'm looking for, you're essentially taking whatever work you choose, and you choose which work you're going to focus on, but I want you to find a theme within that work. So if you chose Metamorphoses, for instance, then I want you to pick one story in there. Maybe it's, the punishment for sin or something like that. And maybe it's the flood and Pyrrha and Deucalion. But I want you to look at how does that theme expressed? What lesson is being told? What is the author kind of saying about that, and about how that affects our human behavior? Or if you're talking about the Iliad, then maybe it's more about the interference of the gods, how much of what happens to us is beyond our control. And so we have to go sometimes, and often we go into events blindly. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do, all we can do is do our best. And that's what being heroic means. I mean, you could also deal with heroism. You could look at gender, or look at, like the rape of Io, and talk about how she really is the victim many times over, because, and mainly because the other people in charge are gods. And so but certainly the fact that Jupiter, forces her, and yet she's punished for what she didn't even voluntarily engage in. So it could be something like that. It can literally be a very small part of this, but then you use research either about the story itself, or those traditions, or other sources that tell about the tale, to kind of talk about that. You can also use other stories that kind of show that helplessness. If Io is helpless in this situation, well, that actually goes along with Apollo's chase after Daphne. She's helpless too. She tries to run away as well. She's not a willing participant, and yet eventually she's going to get raped if she doesn't get turned into a tree. So her only recourse is to be transformed and no longer be a human. And I mean, that's it. That's a terrible ending. If you go back to, you could also compare it to the Iliad, because Briseis had no choice. She was just a slave. And so if she was with Agamemnon, she'd have no choice. If she was with Achilles, she'd have no choice. And so, you could certainly show how that's a common theme that runs around, but mostly I'm looking at how does that theme come out in the work? So like with Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king at the very beginning, fate is probably the number one theme that you could talk about, but you can also talk about parents and children. You could talk about the responsibilities of a king. What is a king supposed to do? And so there's almost everything that we've read it has several different themes that go on, and you can just pick one. So all you're really looking for, it should be somewhere between 2 to 3 pages. And I put in a discussion about did you watch the discussion about the essay assignment? It's in the recordings as well. And then once you've done that, I'm going to, once you've written part 1, and it should be 2 to 3 pages, the second essay is only going to be, it's going to be a revision of that part 1, and then you're going to add another work to it. So you're going to find another work in the second set of readings that match, but also have that theme where it shows up. And I'll help you with that part too. Once I grade that first paper, I'll give you suggestions as to where you can go. Even if it's just a portion of the Inferno or some story within somewhere, I'll find you something that will match and go along with what you're talking about. So if you are really interested in if you found that one story, like you asked me if you could do oh, what's her name? Why can I not remember her name all of a sudden? But if you want to do a story about, because she is raped inside of a temple, and that's why she's punished. So she's punished for something that wasn't even voluntary. Medusa, that's her name. But if you want to talk about that, I know there's at least one more story where women are forced, where women don't have the volition. And so there's always going to be another story. I'll find a path so that what, even if it's not something that's in our regular readings, I bet I can find something else that's in that general area that, because we read little selections of the Decameron and Canterbury tales, but there may be another tale or another story into the Decameron that you could use. And so I will give you very strong suggestions that will go with your theme, if that helps. So watch the video, and if you still have questions, send me another email, okay? And I'll do everything. And if you need to meet by WebEx, even if it's Thursday, and say, okay, these are my questions, this is what I'm trying to do, just let me know, and I can always set a time, okay? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.